History is usually written by the victors. And because of that, the story of the British Empire is often told as a story of civilization. We are told that the British brought railways to India. They brought the English language, the legal system, and modern administration. The narrative suggests that while colonialism was harsh, it was ultimately a vehicle for modernization. That they found a chaotic, backward land and left behind a functioning nation. But what if that story is a lie? What if the benefits of the empire were just a cover-up for the greatest financial heist in human history? For decades, economists debated whether the British Empire made India richer or poorer. But recently, a renowned economist named Utsa Patnaik dug through 2 centuries of tax records and trade data. She calculated exactly how much wealth Britain extracted from India between 1765 and 1938. The number she found is so big, so astronomical, that it is almost impossible to wrap your head around it. It is $45 trillion. To give you some context, $45 trillion is 17 times more than the total annual GDP of the United Kingdom today. It is enough to buy the entire United States economy twice over. This wasn't just trade, it was a systematic machinery designed to suck the life out of one of the world's richest lands and pump it into a small island in the North Atlantic. This is the story of how the golden bird of Asia was caged, starved, and robbed, and how the modern Western world was built on the back of Indian poverty. To understand the scale of this theft, you have to understand what India was before the British arrived. If you go back to the early 18th century, India was not a poor country. In fact, it was the industrial powerhouse of the world. Before the British took control, India accounted for nearly 25% of the entire global economy. 1 out of every $4 generated on Earth came from India. It was the world's leading exporter of textiles, spices, and steel. The quality of Indian cotton and silk was so high that fashionable women in London and Paris refused to wear anything else. European traders, including the British East India Company, came to India because they were desperate for these goods. But there was a problem. Britain had nothing that India wanted. British wool was too hot for the Indian climate. British goods were primitive compared to Indian craftsmanship. So, for decades, if the British wanted Indian goods, they had to pay for them in gold and silver. This was a fair trade. India was getting richer. Britain was getting goods. But everything changed in 1765. This is the year the East India Company took control of the tax collection rights in Bengal. They transitioned from being traders to being rulers. And this is when the great scam began. Here is how the theft worked. It was genius and it was evil. Before 1765, if a British merchant wanted to buy Indian cloth, he had to bring gold from London to pay the Indian weaver. But once the company took over, they started collecting massive taxes from the Indian people. They then used a portion of those same taxes to buy the cloth from the Indian weaver. Think about that for a second. The British were buying Indian goods using Indian money. The Indian weaver didn't know he was being scammed. He handed over his goods and got paid in cash. But that cash had just been taken from his own pocket or the pockets of his neighbours as tax. It was a magic trick. The British stopped bringing gold into India completely. Instead, they were acquiring millions of dollars worth of goods for free. These goods, cotton, opium, indigo, rice, were then shipped back to Europe and sold for massive profits. Those profits didn't go back to India. They went into building the factories of the Industrial Revolution in London, Manchester, and Liverpool. If you have ever wondered how Britain, a small island nation, could afford to build the world's first industrial economy, this is the answer. They didn't just invent steam engines, they funded them with stolen capital. The industrialization of Britain was fueled by the de-industrialization of India, and the destruction was intentional. The British didn't just want free goods, they wanted to eliminate the competition. Remember, Indian textiles were better and cheaper than British ones. So the British destroyed the Indian textile industry. They imposed tariffs of 70% or 80% on Indian cloth sold in Britain, making it too expensive to buy. At the same time, they forced India to open its borders to British machine-made cloth with almost zero tax. The result was a catastrophe. The great weaving centres of Bengal, which had produced the finest fabrics in history, were decimated. Millions of artisans lost their livelihoods. The Governor-General of the East India Company himself reported back to London in 1834 with a chilling sentence. The bones of the cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India. India was transformed from a manufacturer into a supplier of raw materials. They were forced to grow cotton to feed British factories, and then forced to buy back the finished shirts made in those factories. It was a cycle of poverty designed to keep India dependent forever. But the cost wasn't just economic, it was human. And this is the darkest chapter of the story. When you strip a country of its wealth, when you take away its food to sell for profit abroad, you leave the people vulnerable. Under British rule, India suffered a series of terrifying famines. These weren't just bad harvests due to weather. They were policy failures. The most horrific example was the Bengal famine of 1943. This was during World War II. Japan was advancing in Asia, and the British were panicked. But in Bengal, the harvest had been decent. There was food. The problem was that the British administration, led by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, was exporting rice out of India to feed British soldiers and stockpile reserves in Europe. As the famine set in, starving villagers flooded into the city of Calcutta, dying on the sidewalks. Parents tried to sell their children just to get a handful of rice. The local British officials sent urgent telegrams to London asking for food imports to stop the dying. Churchill refused. He blamed the Indians for the famine, saying they breed like rabbits. He even asked, famously and cruelly, if food is so scarce, why hasn't Gandhi died yet? 3 million people died in the Bengal famine. 3 million. That is nearly half the number of people killed in the Holocaust. But while we learn about the crimes of other dictatorships, this crime is often brushed aside as a tragedy of war. It wasn't a tragedy, it was a sacrifice. Britain chose to let 3 million Indians die to ensure their own stockpiles remained full. Now, the defenders of the empire will always point to one thing: the railways. Yes, the famine was bad, they say, but look at the trains. We united the country. Let's look at the railways. It is true that Britain built one of the largest railway networks in the world in India. But they didn't do it for the benefit of Indians. The railways were built for two specific purposes: to move troops quickly to crush rebellions, and to move raw materials from the interior of India to the ports so they could be shipped to Britain. The railways were an extraction tool. They were the straw used to drink the milkshake. Furthermore, the construction of these railways was a massive scam in itself. It was funded entirely by Indian taxpayers, but the contracts were given to private British companies. These companies were guaranteed a 5% profit return by the government, paid for by Indian taxes, regardless of whether the trains made money or not. It was zero risk for British investors and huge cost for the Indian people. 1 mile of railway in India cost 9 times as much to build as a mile of railway in the US, because the British contractors inflated the costs, knowing the Indian taxpayer would foot the bill. So, when the British finally left in 1947, what was the result of 200 years of civilizing rule? They left a country with a literacy rate of just 16%. They left a country where the average life expectancy was 27 years. They left a country that had gone from being 25% of the world economy to less than 4%. They took a society that was a manufacturing giant and turned it into a land of starving farmers. The partition of India and Pakistan, a final gift of the empire, left a legacy of violence and borders drawn in blood that the region is still dealing with today. Today, Britain is a wealthy nation. It speaks of human rights and democracy. The crown jewels sitting in the Tower of London still contain the Kohinoor diamond, taken from India, a literal symbol of the loot. Yet there has never been a formal apology. There has never been reparations. When people in the West look at the developing world, at India, at Pakistan, at Bangladesh, and see poverty, they often assume it is because these cultures failed. They think, why can't they be developed like us? This story tells us the answer. The poverty of the global South is not an accident. It is not a lack of intelligence or hard work. It is the direct result of an extraction engine that ran for 2 centuries. The modern wealth of the West stands on the foundation of that $45 trillion. We cannot change the past. The money is gone. The lives are lost. But we can change the history books. We can stop pretending that the empire was a benevolent force. We can acknowledge that the modern world order was built on a crime scene. The next time someone tells you that colonialism brought civilization, Tell them about the weavers of Bengal. Tell them about the famine of 1943. Tell them about the $45 trillion. The truth is the only tribute we can offer to the millions who paid the ultimate price.